I'm Vicki Hogarth and welcome to Southwest Magazine. I'm joined today by author John Kelly once again, who will be reading a chapter from his book, Meaningful Memories on Partridge Island. Thanks for being here today, John.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. You know, I always enjoy coming in to spend time with you. So let's get started today in terms of what I'm going to do today, which is a bit different than last week where I gave a general talk about who I was. I'm actually going to read an excerpt from one of the chapters today, which all of you will find quite interesting. Now, it's called the Heritage chapter of my book, but it's really about Partridge Island, and I think most of you are aware of where Partridge Island is. It's the island that sits more or less in the middle of the harbor of St. John. So, first of all, let me give you a bit of an introduction as to why Partridge Island has been so important historically. And for those of you who went to school in New Brunswick, you probably all remember we all had to read poems by the famous New Brunswick poet Bliss Carman. Here's Bliss Carman talking about Partridge Island. The Ships of St. John by Bliss Carman, past the lighthouse, past the buoy, past the crimson rising sun. There our dreams go down the harbor with the tall ships of St. John. In the morning I am with them as they clear the island bar, fade till speck by speck the midday has forgotten where they are. But I sight a vaster sea lane, wider leeway, longer run, whose discoveries return not with the ships of grey St. John. Now I put that poem in there because of a discovery I'm going to tell you about with Partridge Island. Okay, so I'm going to bring you into the loop. Now, let me bring you into the loop on what the significance of Partridge Island became for me as I learned the importance of embracing heritage as a meaningful memory that would have an undeniable impact on me. My grade 4 teacher, Miss Hunt, that was her name, her room looked out over the harbor directly to Partridge Island. One of our new classmates for that year was Tommy Furness. Her welcome to him was accompanied by a suggestion that we all glance out the window of our schoolroom to see where Tommy lived. His father was a lighthouse keeper in Partridge Island. Oh. Tommy pointed out the small white speck that was his family home. The combination of winter weather and the rush of the world-famous torrential Bay of Fundy tides made the 1 kilometer narrow crossing from the island to land a risky proposition at any time, and treacherous in a winter storm. Tommy was shipped ashore in September to stay with his grandparents until spring. I would steal a glance at him once in a while to watch him looking longingly out the window on a clear day to see just how close his family was, and obviously wishing he was there with them. Tommy told us what it was like to live in what I quickly learned from his stories was a very special place for all of us. There were the remains of fortifications from World War II to romp through. He could look out to the Bay of Fundy every day and watch the big cargo ships coming and going through the harbor. At night, he could follow the swing of the giant light from the lighthouse and peer out to the bay to try and sight a ship. Then there was the foghorn blaring out warnings to ships through the dense fog. Oh, and by the way, Tommy told us about an enormous Gaelic cross on the island to commemorate the thousands of Irish immigrants who perished during the mass migration from the potato famine in Ireland in 1847. The casual mention of the mass migration of Irish Catholics and a Gaelic cross caught my attention. Oh, the Irish potato famine migration to St. John was now 3 generations ago in a bygone era between 1815 and 1867 when we came to Canadian Confederation. Now, in that period, 150,000 Irish immigrants passed through St. John via Partridge Island at the edge of the harbor. It was Canada's really first quarantine station, along with in Quebec, Gros Isle in Quebec. In our typical understated Canadian way, it's virtually unknown and unacknowledged that Partridge Island predates New York's famous Ellis Island by more than 100 years. Yes, we were first on the block in bringing these immigrants in. Moreover, an estimated 3 million immigrants were processed through Partridge Island as a point of entry to the Canadian colonies and subsequently Canada over about a 125-year period. So if we go all across the country, somebody probably has a relative that one way or another came through Partridge Island. Now, Ellis Island processed 12 million at a facility 10 times the size during its tenure. Here's something interesting. The first immigrant admitted to Ellis Island when it opened in 1892 was an Irish Catholic girl. So I took some pride in that. And how do I know it? Because in my quest to understand and appreciate my heritage and culture, I visited Ellis Island. Unlike a forlorn Partridge Island, Ellis Island was a robust testament to the American dream. The Statue of Liberty holds out her hand with a flaming torch, and at the base of the statue is a plaque with that oft-quoted welcome. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free from the wretched refuge of your teeming shore. Every American on the tour was so proud to be an American, while my community remained blissfully unaware of our contribution. Now, during the peak of Irish immigration, through the potato famine, more than 30,000 Irish immigrants arrived in St. John, with 1847 being the record year when 16,000 were processed. An estimated 2,000 Irish perished on Partridge Island during the famine migration. That was to be expected by immigrants already half starved, who had made a journey across the ocean in the cramped bowels of a ship for 10 days or more, with no access to clean water or basic hygiene. Of course, most of those stubborn Irish did survive and make it ashore. By 1850, the Irish community of St. John, Canada's loyalist city, had swelled to 30,000 more than the pre-famine population of the city. The majority moved on to Montreal, Toronto, and the Boston States, of course, but in 1871, the census indicates 55% of the population of St. John was of Irish descent, the largest per capita concentration of Irish of any North American city. What did those loyalists think of that? Oh my goodness. So many Irish immigrants to Canada used Partridge Island as their point of entry that it was nicknamed the Emerald Isle. The Gaelic Cross was erected in 1927 to commemorate Irish immigration. But times change. All that took place in a bygone era. As a young boy, all I could do was look at the island. I didn't own a boat. Even if I did, crossing that 1 kilometer of turbulent Bay of Fundy water from the west side beach area to the island was tricky. Tommy Furness could attest to that by his parents deciding to settle him on the mainland for the school year. So I did the next best thing. I began to read all about Partridge Island. Oh, and the more I read, the more intrigued I became. Now let me digress for a bit. My recollection of A Tale of Two Communities, which is another chapter in the book, talks about how the Rifle Range neighborhood in the north end of St. John was constructed after World War II using the British what's called the Mews model. 2 rows of townhouses with a green space courtyard in the middle. Every court had a designated name. As a young boy who lived just up the street from the Rifle Range in Douglas Avenue, I decided to look up the history behind the names to find out what the people had accomplished to warrant having a court named in honor of them. One of the courts was named Fowlis Court. Robert Fowlis was the inventor of the foghorn. You'll recall that popular Irish colloquialism, folklore and history have legs. Keep that in mind. Apparently in 1853, as Thomas Fowlis was walking towards his house on a foggy night, he heard his daughter playing her piano. Noticing he could only hear the very low voices of the piano, he realized that a device that emitted low-frequency sound could be used to warn ships that they were approaching St. John Harbor in the dense fog. As is the case with many inventions, Fowlis spent several frustrating years initially perfecting the invention of the foghorn and then convincing government bureaucrats to permit him to install it. Eventually, the world's first foghorn was set up in Partridge Island in 1859. We all know this, all of us who have been aboard a ship on a cruise today. The foghorn went on to attain worldwide adoption and acclaim as an invaluable early warning system in sea travel. Wow! Not only did I want to have a close-up look at a site that was where my Irish Catholic heritage originated in Canada, I was also keen to stand at the head of this small island and bear witness to the birthplace of a world-renowned invention that had transformed the global shipping industry. Ironically, in spite of its historical significance from both a heritage and technology perspective, direct access was still prohibited in my youth. Partridge Island had been exclusively reserved by the federal government for manning ship access to the harbor. I bided my time. Over the next 10 to 12 years, I kept an eye on the construction of a stone breakwater barrier being constructed from Bayshore to the island. It was operational, although far from easily traversable by 1966. Now, I confess to being an adventurous Irish lad. Now in university and fully grown up, I took it upon myself to do something responsible grown-ups aren't supposed to do. I embarked on an illegal adventure by crawling across the barely traversable breakwater, being careful not to slip and fall into the turbulent Bay of Fundy ice-cold water, and then climbing up the steep hill to Partridge Island. I brazenly walked across the 26-acre crop of rock to get an up-close look at the famous Gaelic cross. It was a memorable moment. It made me forever appreciate the importance of heritage in the development of pride in one's culture and the contribution it makes in contributing to active community living. Since I was on the island, I decided to conduct my own customized self-guided tour. A combination of the closure and the abandonment of the Immigration Processing Center at the beginning of the 20th century, along with the desecration of the grave sites to construct World War II cannon defense, had resulted in the island becoming derelict, with the exception of the lighthouse encampment. I ventured over to the lighthouse and struck up a conversation with the lighthouse keeper, who got a chuckle out of my audacity. He was surprised to learn that Partridge Island was the birthplace of the foghorn. He assured me, as someone who'd walked the island many times, that there was no plaque marking the site of the installation. Knowing of my interest in all things about Partridge Island, he took me on a walkabout to show me what the island once had by way of an extensive immigration center and dedicated grave sites for two groups in particular, the 2,000 Irish Catholics and, listen to this, several hundred Jews. The latter, as is the case with so much of Jewish heritage, was an understated group who also came through Partridge Island in hordes to seek refuge from extreme religious persecution in Europe and live life to the fullest in Canada. You'll read a bit more about this in another chapter of my book. We concluded our tour at the lighthouse, where the keeper got me to match the time of my watch with the national time signal at the lighthouse when it struck 3 p.m. With that, he escorted me back to the cliff edge and watched to make sure I got safely on the breakwater to head back to the mainland. Now, think about this. What I had witnessed firsthand was a national disgrace by a combination of short-sighted politicians and formula-focused bureaucrats who would facilitate the destruction of this iconic historic site. It was primarily through what Tommy Furness said, which I now realize was an example of folklore and oral history that he was passing on from what his parents and grandparents had passed on to him, that I discovered an important part of my life, my cultural heritage as an Irish Catholic St. John boy. Well, that's a bit of a read from that chapter, and it goes on with the rekindling about different parts of Irish heritage and how I explored Irish heritage in all of these, a number of communities across North America out of this.
Wow.
Yeah, so in any event, that's part of it. But there's a couple of things I want to add on to this. First of all, here's an anecdote in terms of just how ubiquitous Partridge Island was for so many people that live all across the country. Now, when I was in university, one of my friends married a Jewish girl. And so I was the best man at the wedding, and we all showed up at the wedding, of course. And then we had to go into the back of the chapel after the wedding and sign documents and this kind of thing. And so as we were signing the documents, the mother, of course, who I got to know, was quite proud of the fact that she was from Winnipeg initially. And of course, in those days, up until about 1970, the largest Jewish per capita population in all of North America was not New York, it was Winnipeg. In other words, all of these Jews had sort of migrated and found Winnipeg as a place to sort of make their home. And so, laughingly then said, so, I said, cousin, I said, here we are, both St. Johners at this thing. And she was we all got quite a kick out of that. And so that's just an example of just how extensive this whole migration is, and basically the contribution that, I'll say it this way, not just St. John, and I'm going to say Charlotte County actually played in welcoming immigrants into this country. And now let me just kind of like read this little excerpt from you, which isn't in my book, but and it's about this tiny little island in a place called the village of St. Andrews by the sea. Now, it's only 3/4 of an acre. And what happened during the early 1800s is that the community of St. Andrews built a small hospital with simple medical facilities on this piece of island. It opened in 1832, and it was initially set up to manage the cholera outbreak. In 1847, the site was renamed Hospital Island. And the reason it was renamed Hospital Island, because of course, there was this, and much as I talked about Partridge Island, there was this influx of all these ships coming in with Irish, basically immigrants on them, many of whom, as we now know, were near starvation and in some cases near death. So, again, of all places, we don't think of this, but St. Andrews became a gateway and stopping place for these Irish immigrants, and more than 200 of these people died on this little 3/4-acre island. Now, unfortunately, what happened in that case was a natural disaster. Apparently, there was this big gale in 1869 that's known as basically the Saxby Gale, which some of you who basically know the history of St. Andrews well might be quite familiar with. And so it desecrated and destroyed most of the grave sites that were on that island. And so is that all forgotten now? And basically what's going to happen with that? No. And this basically talks about the contribution that we're all prepared to make, those of us who live along the Bay of Fundy. And I'm, as you know, you read from my book, I'm a Bay of Fundy boy. And this is what some of the Bay of Fundy boys did. In 1995, they erected a monument at Indian Point in St. Andrews. And the next time you're driving around the point in St. Andrews where the campground is, stop your car and you're going to see this Gaelic monument. It's actually quite interesting. Get out of your car, walk across some grass, and what you're going to read is this inscription: in memory of those men, women, and children who died of hunger and disease while fleeing the potato famine in Ireland and lie buried on Hospital Island, lovingly remembered by their descendants. That's us who live here, lovingly remembered by their descendants who persevered and helped build this great nation. Erected May 28, 1995, by the Charlotte County chapter of the Irish Canadian Cultural Association of New Brunswick. So there you go. And that's an example of how it's not just my meaningful memory, but there's a meaningful memory really that we should not lose sight of and we should recall, that's really so much about the people and the culture of what I like to call it, and I used to laugh at this when I was growing up, when I was at university and far enough places I'd say I was a Bay of Fundy boy, but all along, we talk about Charlotte County, the Bay of Fundy, and these communities around here that do this. And it's so very important today that we make this known and let this be known, because of course we're now, as you all know, facing a new wave of immigration. And just, I guess in the past year, we all heard the news, 10,000 immigrants from, most of them from the strange place that I came from, called Ontario, have now come home. Not come home, but have come home. They're moving it. In my case, I came home back to New Brunswick. I was born and brought up in St. John and then was in Toronto and returned, but have come into New Brunswick and I want to come into New Brunswick. And I think it's very important for us to get this message out and let these people know that this really is a place that is filled with very wonderful live-in active communities and an active community culture that they can themselves become happy and live lives to the fullest, just as beginning with my grandparents and so many of your grandparents and people did come and make a go of it here. So there's a start for you.
Interestingly enough, John, we have this influx of new people coming to New Brunswick during a pandemic as well.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're not using Hospital Island this time around. But I know during the COVID-19 pandemic, being here in St. Andrews, I'd often spend time alone, just going around town and taking it in. And you would look out to that island and think of the history. And it took on a different significance for me, having lived in a time with something like a pandemic I never thought I'd experience in my lifetime. Do you think that adds to the importance of preserving these sites as historic?
Well, it certainly does, and I'm glad that you brought that up. I hadn't actually thought of it in terms of the pandemic, but of course, what initially spurred people on, much as if we go back to the Irish, the Irish back in the 1840s, is that it was a potato famine, we'll say, which was equivalent to the pandemic we have right now, is that they were then looking around and saying, well, where could there be a good life? In other words, there's not a good life for us here in Ireland, and so many of these people that have come in because of the pandemic, now I don't want to make it sound as though that they're all poor and downtrodden, some of them aren't. And we all know if we live here and we look around, some of these people are living a life that is not in downtrodden homes or whatever, but they're here and they're good people, me among them. But it is true that that you brought up, there's the analogy. So we have this pandemic and we have again people looking at New Brunswick as a place where they should and could live and have a good life. And what we should be doing, and we are doing this, I want to sort of compliment so many of the, I guess I would just want to call it community groups and people like this. And in fact, people are surprised when I show this to them. I was taking some friends around this summer and we were going through St. George, and so driving along the main street of St. George. And all of a sudden they looked out and they said, wait a minute, there's this building and it's called the St. George, the Charlotte County Multicultural Association. They said, I thought everybody in St. George was, and I'm saying this because I'm living here, it was just kind of like, this was kind of a fishing community or something, and just all of these traditional people lived here. And I said, no, I said, there are all kinds of new people that are coming into this community. And we can go on and on about this, and I'm sure CHCO knows more about this than I do, and you've done interviews about this, about the Romanian community that's moved into Black's Harbor and all of these things going on. So think of that, and think of the fact of, look at where we are today. We are where we are and have done well and do have a great style of life because we brought these immigrants in here. We're talking about the Irish immigrants. And it's people that aren't from here oftentimes surprised. They think that we're all loyalists that live in, and of course the loyalists did come to St. Andrews, but when you drive through Charlotte County, you see how many people do still have these, have these Irish names. It all relates to the fact that they got off the boat and said, well, I'm here now. In other words, that I'm going to find a place and a way to sort of make a life for myself and my family here. And so, we can still do that today, and we are starting to do that. And this is the kind of thing that will make us much more receptive to that, understanding our heritage and culture, and realizing that we can make this space for these people.
Now, back on the topic of Partridge Island, I believe 1974 it was declared a National Historic Site, which means the 50th anniversary of that is next year. Yeah. Do you think there are efforts underway to bring this history more to light? It's not a history I knew a lot about.
Well, there is. It's been going on now, just not in the past year, but it's been going on since the time not since I was the time of the boy, but let's say particularly over the last, I'll say 20 years. There now has been this movement, I'll call it, various groups form and attempt to get the federal government to change the status of Partridge Island to, and again, it's not just a National Historic Site or a heritage site, but also to sort of say that it's not a restricted federal government, I guess what do we call it, navigation site, however you want to phrase that, because, we all want safe navigation. But the days when we needed the lighthouse keeper in Partridge Island, and the foghorn going, are all over now. As we all know, ships have these computers on them, and they thankfully guide them into the harbor. So we don't. So there's no need for that to continue that designation of Partridge Island, and I would certainly encourage people. I can easily get that if people would like to know. If you would really like to become part of that, if you do have Irish heritage, say, damn it, we should do something about this. Yeah, I can arrange to have you connect with people in St. John, that would like to, that are moving forward on this. And so that's the way it goes. Now, I should also mention this, of course, and that is why I wrote this book. This book is not going to make me a multimillionaire, okay? In other words, so I wrote the book because in many respects, I wanted to record this and sort of make a contribution back to the community. And so if you would like to buy the book, and I would certainly encourage people to buy it, you can certainly buy it at the bookstores, particularly here, in St. John. And in addition to that, if you go to my website, which is just www.johngkelly.ca, you'll see a promotional thing for the book, which is a fun video to look at for those of you that are familiar with the Bay of Fundy. And you can order the book online through there. You can also get the book directly from me, and how I'd like to do that, because I do want to do things for the community. If people in your community would like me to come and do a reading, I would love to come to your community and do a reading of I'm saying, I've just named, like, whether it's St. George, Grand Manan, Macadam, we can go through the list of where all these places are, or just a community group that would like me to do this. Yeah, invite me to come to that. And what I will do to show that what I want to do is to be part of your community, and then you'll be part of what we're doing, is I always then set aside and make a donation for part of the proceeds of the sale of that book to a preferred, again, charity or organization that the community would like to contribute to. So we can all perhaps work around that as well and benefit from that.
Wonderful. Well, we're out of time today, but I'm sure I'll have you back again soon to read a different chapter and illuminate us on a different piece of New Brunswick's history.
Sure. Just to let you know as a teaser, okay, we always like to give a teaser of something coming on. When I come back the next time, my whole reading of that time is going to be about the port. In the port of St. John, which is, if you drive into St. John, you'll see the port is in this major rebirth. And I'm going to tell you like where the heritage of that port is and how we, as St. Johners in those days growing up, were so proud of that. We were the breadbasket for Europe. In other words, there's a war in Ukraine now, but it was out of St. John Harbor that all that grain after the war and during the war went over to Europe to keep people fed.
Well, I look forward to that.
Well, you'll hear about it. Sure.
Thanks so much for being here today, John.
Well, thank you.
My guest today has been John Kelly, author of Meaningful Memories. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.